Hey guys, this is Matt Core from ControlPaint.com, and I want to just thank you for buying this series. You're helping the project to continue, and it's your support that makes it all possible. And this premium series is especially exciting for me because we're finishing off something that I've put a lot of work into, and that is the idea of making a grayscale rendering, which, let's face it, it's the foundation of all the painting you're ever going to do. So in this video, we are going to put all the pieces together and make an illustration. So let's pretend for a minute that you are an author and you start out to write your next novel and you spend the first, 300 pages, and all you do is describe the weather. And then after that, you introduce the protagonist and then, proceed in the way you'd expect. Well, my guess is the audience is probably not going to get 300 pages in. They're probably going to stop. And they're not stopping because you have bad grammar or because you don't use good word choices. Stylistically, you might have a lot going for you. But you've made the critical error, which is the structure of your piece just isn't really very smart. The reader's no longer interested because you haven't given them a nice plot to follow. So the point is, no matter how beautiful your prose is, the structure is very important. The way that you lay it out for the audience matters. And as a painter, you have the same deal. You have tools, which are your ability to render light and describe materials and all the things we've been talking about in the parts 1 through 3. But all of that hinges on what we call composition. This is like the glue or the blueprint, however you want to think about it, that holds together all of your technical abilities. And it is what gives the viewer a plot to follow. It is the story. So over the course of this series, what we are going to do is take this painting I made as an example. It is an example of a couple things. First, it is an example of just one workflow. I'm going to structure the videos in this series to follow essentially the way I treat most paintings. We'll start from a very rough sketch and follow all the way through to this finished rendering. But it's also going to focus on this idea of composition. At the big scale and the small scale, we're going to talk about various artistic choices that I'm making in order to make it a clear image. And remember, that's different from making it a realistic image. It's different from being able to be very, very accurate with my materials and my lighting. Those are separate. This is an artistic choice. This is me deciding where I want to put the characters, where I want the light set up. Really, it's a lot like being the director of your own little one-shot movie. So it starts out with a thumbnail. And thumbnail is the loosest, most sort of experimental part of the process. Next, we move to the rough phase. And this is where I add a little more information. I start thinking about lighting and local values, what types of materials might be here. This would be a nice time to get out reference material and really start solving those problems. And then it's time to sort of enlarge the image and start polishing. So the next phase is I will make a new canvas and I'll make nice line work. At this point, I also like to usually make paths, and if you watch the Edge Control series, you can learn a lot more about this. But this really just preps my canvas to be able to then make a very controlled painting. So once all that's set up, the next phase is the block in. And this is where I just put paint on the entire canvas. There's a couple different ways of doing this, and we'll look at two. But what this allows me to do is to just be ready to start polishing. So the next phase is the base render. I'm not thinking about special materials here. I'm just sort of giving a nice, cleaner treatment to everything in the image. You could really think of this as almost like a cleanup phase to get it ready for the nice polish that's going to follow. Once I'm done with this, I'm going to do a quick texture overlay. And this is to sort of cheat realism. I've done most of the work so far to make it look carefully rendered, but adding a little bit of photo texture on top, when used sparingly, can really take it up a notch. And then once you've done all these details and all the fine little brushwork, it's time to balance the image. And this is the final phase. The idea here is when I finish my rough, I had sort of solved problems and come to a nice statement. You could look at the rough and get what's going on. Even though there weren't any small details, it was clear. And to me, that's what painting is all about. It's getting clarity. We're not trying to impress anybody with how many perfectly rendered bricks we can make. We're trying to tell them a story. So this final phase here, I think of as final balancing. And what I'm doing is trying to bring my sort of detailed rendering back full circle to look like the rough. So a lot of times this means making certain areas lighter and other areas darker, or lowering detail or adding detail, whatever it is, such that I can sort of shrink down my large, polished rendering and sit it next to my rough and have them look pretty similar. Because it's easy to go off track. It's easy to have a rough and then start painting your large image and have it end up looking like a totally different painting. And that's not the idea. What we want is them to look pretty similar. So at a high level, that's all we're going to be doing. And over the next hour, we're going to go into much more detail in each of these phases. But before we do that, I want to spend the rest of this video talking about the idea of designing a value pattern, which is just a fancy way of saying laying out our composition, but thinking about it not in lines, but in tone. Because here I've made just a very, very simple example. It happens to be a 3D render, but I want to show you what happens with just making simple changes. Right now, it looks pretty boring, but think about this guy standing under the arch as a character. I know he's a rectangle, but just bear with me here. Right now, the only thing that stands out in the scene are these sort of very soft shadows. Well, if all I did was change the sky value, now the architecture, it becomes much more visible. But the character is still kind of hard to see, and there's really not a lot of visual interest. Okay, so now I will give it a strong sun. All I've done here is created some sort of dramatic cast shadows, and now the character becomes a little more visible. All right, so I'll step back. I will take the dramatic sun away for a second, and now I'm going to change the staging a little bit. So here I'm going to change the local value of the architecture and of the characters, and now they become a lot more clear. I bet you didn't even notice the first time around that there was a second character. So I'll flip it back for a sec. You can see in the very distance there is a little bit of a different value, and there is in fact a different character. So this is the danger of not making smart compositional choices. If what you need to do is tell a story that involves two characters, and because of the choices you make, only one of them is visible, well, that's your fault. That is not a photograph where he happened to be standing in a shadow. No, you're the director. It is up to you to decide on materials and types of light that'll emphasize whatever it is you want to emphasize. Because really what you're doing is you're making sort of a contrast puzzle, as in, I can see these two characters because they are a very light value and they are on a relatively darker background. And so the way I made them visually separate was to be just a different value than their surroundings. In the case of the previous example, I could knock out that first character by surrounding him with a dark cast shadow. But as you can see in the background, the second character is invisible with this lighting setup. So now we'll try another angle, and this time we've got the foreground silhouetted and the background is illuminated. And this gives you sort of a different storytelling example. Here the emphasis is on the character in the back, and the character in the foreground is more of a shadowy, mysterious figure. And I've achieved this by choosing both lighting, as in I only have lights in the background, but also in the local value of the materials. So here I've chosen what color to paint the walls and what color the floor should be in order to control the contrast. I knew I wanted the background character to stand out. I wanted essentially visual arrows pointing at him. And then I just made artistic choices to back that up. I could change the position of the light and make it more of a balanced scene. Now it's both characters being lit by the same light source, one in the foreground, one in the background, but now they're maybe addressing one another. Where in the previous example, maybe it was one character spying on another. Now you have two characters that are sort of an equal footing. And all I've changed here is where is the light. You know, you could change this and make it all a homogeneous local value. It's all white and have a very sort of angelic light source. And what previously felt like a sort of mysterious voyeuristic scene now becomes something totally different. And then the other choice that you can make, which I've not shown in these examples, is just move stuff. Remember, you are not taking photos. If what you need to do is make a character stand out from the background, why not put them in front of a doorway or something where it's a dark shape put there intentionally in order to pop them out? And this is why I sometimes think of it as a puzzle. Because what you have to do is say, okay, I have a light character So that means if I want them to stand out, they need to have a dark background. Okay, easy. What if they're wearing a light shirt and dark jeans? Well, then it gets a little more complicated. So you have to have something that is both contrasty, dark behind their light shirt, but that's also light to contrast against their dark jeans. And for this, you have the ability to change the staging. You can put some potted plant behind them if you want to. It could be a cast shadow. It could be simply a rendering trick. Sometimes it's okay to just cheat the way you're rendering a form in order to make an edge a little bit more visible. But this is the game that we play. Clear images don't just happen accidentally. It's really up to you to make every tone count. Because sure, I agree, your image does need a potted plant. But if you're going to put it there anyway, why not make the tones enhance what you're trying to say, instead of sort of confusing the image? The important thing to remember is that the eye looks for contrast. So if you have high contrast, that's what your audience is going to look at. If you have low contrast, they might miss it completely. So use that to your advantage. Use it intentionally. Have a focal point, make sure the audience is going to look at it, and do that with tone. Because look, these examples are obviously not very beautiful. They are rectangles standing in a very simple diorama, but they each tell a very different story. So think what you could do with your own line art. These choices are a big deal. And so when you're moving from a thumbnail into a rough, this is what you're going to be deciding on. We are making a value pattern based on the staging. What kind of lights are we going to use? What kind of local values? So in the next video, I want to talk about how I arrive at my final rough and the various experiments that it went through along the way.